When you ask for evidence for God, what do you get? Arguments! And sometimes arguments are conflated with evidence, or if you get enough arguments, that counts as evidence, supposedly. Well, it really doesn't, but that's what we're dealing with right now in my series on arguments, and why arguments for God are bad. I have another 2 arguments for you today. The argument from truth and the ontological argument. Again, what I consider 2 bad arguments for God. Let's go. Hi, my name is Scarlett, and I'm an atheist and skeptic, and I have been doing this series on arguments for God, and why they're terrible, and why they fail. And today's arguments also are terrible, and they fail. So, as usual, I fired up my search engine. I located a blog, this blog, and I have to say this introductory page is simple and elegant and uncluttered. No pop-ups, no busy scrawly things, no hawking every product under the sun. Just a very, very simple design. Really like it. It is for this philosopher named Peter Kreeft. Here is the picture you can find on the wiki. John Peter Kreeft, born in 1937 and got his education at Calvin College and then Fordham University, both an MA and a PhD. By the way, I know this man's name is pronounced Kreeft because the person who puts together his webpage has this note that his last name is pronounced Kreeft, not any other way. So kind of a German pronunciation there. So that's what we're going to say. We're going to say Kreeft. That's his name. And not only did this person get education at decent places, he is also a professor of philosophy at Boston College and the King's College, and this is a Manhattan-based organization. So we have a real live philosopher here. This isn't just some apologist. This is somebody who has a real education and a real academic career in philosophy. So I'm kind of curious to see how he does on these arguments. It will be interesting and I think very different from what we've been reading from apologists. Here's a more recent picture because that other one obviously was taken a little while ago. And I really like the bio that's on the webpage. The About section reads, Peter Kreeft, PhD, is a professor of philosophy at Boston College. He loves his 5 grandchildren, 4 children, 1 wife, 1 cat, and 1 god. I wonder if the cat and god are the same. That's what I would say. Anyway, he has written over 100 books. And I like this. This is a very unassuming kind of bio. It's just, this is who he is. There's no award-winning, no best-selling, just he's written some books. Like, this is like a real academic. And About the author over on Amazon provides a little bit more information. Obviously, professor of philosophy at Boston College and yada yada. We can see the King's College's Empire State Building. But Kreeft also did postdoc work at Yale. Not too shabby if you ask me. And he's received honors for achievements in the fields of philosophy, and he lists them. This is much better than saying you're award-winning. Like, we could actually look up these awards and see what they're for and everything. A lot of these are fellowships, so the awards are actually to go do more scholarship. So anyway, back on his webpage, he has a list of 20 arguments for God's existence, and that's where I pulled out the 2 that I'm going to be discussing today. And just so we're clear on the denomination, Kreeft is a Catholic. He converted to Catholicism from some flavor of Protestantism. So there we go. There is the blibbity blab for today. The arguments, once again, are the argument from truth and the ontological argument. And luckily, the argument from truth is very quick. So let's get going. So the argument from truth reads, this argument is closely related to the argument from consciousness. It comes mainly from Augustine. Premise 1. Our limited minds can discover eternal truths about being. All right, so just thinking about this, our limited minds, I don't have a problem with. We are limited beings. We exist in a space and a time, and we can't know everything. We don't have access to all knowledge, so that's fine. But eternal truths about being, I'm not quite sure what this refers to. This is a concept that would need some fleshing out. Like, I believe that we can discover truths. Whether those truths are eternal or not, it just sounds weird to me because in my mind, truth is about what corresponds to reality, and reality itself is likely not eternal. I don't know, maybe I'm wrong there. I'm willing to be wrong there. And so eternal truths about being, I'd need more information, but off the top of my head, I would say I'm not sure that these exist. Like, I would need some more information. On to premise 2. Truth properly resides in a mind. All right, so I don't know about this word properly in here. Truth resides in a mind. This is kind of interesting. It makes it sound like truth is a being that has an address, and the address is, the mind. But I guess if we want to translate this to mean we construct the truth of the world in our mind, and there's no other place for us to construct it, that's fine. But, the truth that we are discovering is out in the world, and then the mind grasps what is happening. And therefore, in my mind, truth is sort of in an in-between place. It is what is happening that our minds have understood as truth. All right, maybe I'm overthinking this. I don't know. I don't know what he's going to say in the next paragraph, but here we go. And then premise 3, but the human mind is not eternal. No problem with this. No human mind is eternal. We are finite beings. Our minds will cease when our body ceases. And then the conclusion is, therefore, there must exist an eternal mind in which these truths reside. And so this is where I have a problem. It is as if these truths are sort of the Platonic forms, like they have to exist somewhere. If they exist in our mind, it's because that's a shadow of some eternal truth that's in some space, some Platonic space elsewhere. But I don't know that there can be an eternal mind. And I don't think that truth is something that can exist without something to think that which is true. Again, I'm thinking of truth as an in-between space. Something happens, there are things in the world that our minds understand as true. And without the things in the world, there's nothing to be true. And without our minds, there's not something that can grasp that they are true. But I don't think that there's an eternal mind. Those things that we've understood cease with us. Let's go on and see the description. So Kreeft's little description about this. This proof might appeal to someone who shares a Platonic view of knowledge. Yes, indeed, I called that, yes. Somebody that likes the Platonic forms and who thinks that knowledge is that Platonic thing of there being a form, and our truth, our limited truth, is a shadow of that eternal truth. Yes. Kreeft goes on. Who, for example, believes that there are eternal, intelligible forms which are present to the mind in every act of knowledge. Yep, okay, that's the Platonic view. Given that view, it is a very short step to see these eternal forms as properly existing within an eternal mind. And there is a good deal to be said for this. But that is just the problem. There is too much about the theory of knowledge that needs to be said before this could work as a persuasive demonstration. So I do find it kind of interesting that Kreeft here seems to be indicating that this is not a great argument, that we need to flesh out more about a theory of knowledge. Going back up into his discussion, this believes that there are eternal, intelligible forms. I'd have to ask, why would somebody believe this Platonic view of knowledge, that there is something that is an eternal mind that keeps these forms, or a space, a Platonic space of these forms? Is there any evidence of that, or is that just something, that somebody pulled out of their backside? Because I don't think that there's any evidence. Kreeft linked this to the argument from consciousness, and I think that that is one of the connections to this Platonic view. And the consciousness is, if we have consciousness, there kind of has to be this eternal being with consciousness. We have a kernel of the eternal consciousness, or some people think that the universe has a consciousness and our consciousness is a speck of that. And this is sort of a similar thing, that for us to hold on to any truths, there must be an eternal truth. Or there's no eternal truth. There cannot be truth. Of course, I'm not sure that there are eternal truths, as I said before. But anyway, I do like this one sentence, and there is a good deal to be said for this. Like a good deal to be said about eternal forms existing in eternal mind. I would like to hear more. Yes, please say some more. But the problem, I think, is this theory of knowledge that needs to be worked out needs to leave the space of philosophy. Like, it's great for philosophers to think about minds and how they work, But we do now have neuroscience, and we can do experiments on brains to see how brains work and how brains build knowledge and how brains build memory. And we're getting closer to notions of why we might have consciousness or what consciousness is, how it works, these kinds of things. All of these are attached to physical brains, the mind as the activity that the brain does. So anyway, I do agree you need to work out your theory of knowledge before this can be something that works. And also you need to flesh out what the heck are those eternal truths about being? What does that mean? Like intuitively, it sounds great, but when you start to think about it, what is that? What are these eternal truths about being that need an eternal mind? I mean, I can think of some things like, to be alive means that sometimes you suffer. To me, that would be an eternal truth about being, but I don't think you need an eternal mind. You need a body that has that suffering, or also there's emotional suffering. So anyway, I do like it. I think that Kreeft here recognizes the limits of what's going on and says this isn't a persuasive demonstration. We're moving on to the ontological argument, and I like the way this person writes. This is simple, it is very philosophical, and seems to be aware of limits. So let's see what we have about the ontological argument, which to me is simply about defining God into existence. So let's see. Kreeft writes, the ontological argument was devised by Anselm of Canterbury, who wanted to produce a single, simple demonstration which would show that God is and what God is. Single it may be, but far from simple. It is perhaps the most controversial proof, don't like that word, for the existence of God. It's an argument, okay? It's just an argument. Most people who first hear it are tempted to dismiss it immediately as an interesting riddle. Yeah, I think it's just defining God into existence, but okay, enough commentary. But distinguished thinkers of every age, including our own, have risen to defend it. For this very reason, it is the most intensely philosophical proof, it's not a proof, it's an argument, for God's existence. Its place of honor is not within popular piety, but rather textbooks and professional journals. We include it with a minimum of discussion, not because we think it conclusive or irrefutable, but for the sake of completeness. All right, so I don't think Kreeft is all that convinced by this. It's just an interesting philosophical exercise for him. And by the way, I think that Kreeft comes from a time when people used we instead of I. Now, I recall back when I was taught how to write that I was never supposed to use the word I. If I wanted to state an opinion, it had to be like from a we perspective. We think and we presume and we conclude and things like that. So I think when Kreeft uses the word we, this is kind of like a royal we. It is Kreeft and this is his writing style. So we're just going to go with that because it's not really an important detail. Overall, I find he writes really well. There are some slippery pieces here and there, like saying proof instead of argument, but there you go. All right, so let's go on and see what this argument does. All right, we start with Anselm's version. Premise 1, it is greater for a thing to exist in the mind and in reality than in the mind alone. Maybe? Okay, I'm not sure about that premise. Number 2, God means that than which a greater cannot be thought. Than which a greater cannot be thought. I guess the being, there's not a being that can be thought greater than that. I find that really weird language, but okay, so God is like the greatest. He's the GOAT. I mean, I don't agree, but I guess that's what we're saying, and I'd like a demonstration of this. All right, premise 3, suppose that God exists in the mind, but not in reality. Okay, we're just supposing this. I suppose that God exists in this place. All right. 4, then a greater than God could be thought, namely a being that has all the qualities our thought of God has, plus real existence. We're still just thinking the being, though. We're thinking he has existence. We haven't demonstrated he has existence. I mean, I don't even think this is a riddle. I think that was very generous of Kreeft to call this a riddle because we're just like entertaining thoughts in our mind. 5, but this is impossible, for God is that than which a greater cannot be thought. Okay, we just assumed that. We've created that definition of God. We've created a bunch of suppositions. And then we get to our conclusion, therefore God exists in the mind and in reality. And it's just word games. just word games. This isn't even a riddle. I don't think that there's a riddle in here. We're defining God. We're defining what is greater. We're assuming these things. And then we're saying, so God is real. All right, poof, there you are. Kreeft follows up with some questions and replies. Question 1, suppose I deny that God exists in the mind. Reply, in that case, the argument could not conclude that God exists in the mind and in reality. But note, the denial commits you to the view that there is no concept of God, and very few would wish to go that far. Yeah, I mean, and of course we're using this slippery language, like this is the concept of God that exists in the mind. I have a concept of God. So I wouldn't deny that we have a concept of God, because it's obvious that people have concepts of God. All right, let's go on. Question 2. Is it really greater for something to exist in the mind and in reality than in the mind alone? Good question. Reply, the first premise of this argument is often misunderstood. People sometimes say, isn't an imaginary disease better than a real one? Well, it certainly is better, and so a greater thing for you that the disease is not real, but that strengthens Anselm's side of the argument. Real bacteria are greater than imaginary ones, just because they have something that imaginary ones lack, real being. They have an independence and therefore an ability to harm that nothing can have whose existence is wholly dependent on your thought. It is this greater level of independence that makes them greater as beings, and that line of thinking does not seem elusive or far-fetched. Well, really what I think this demonstrates is, like, what does it mean to be greater? What does that mean? And so now we have another definition layered on over the initial definition, that to be greater is to have this level of independence. And I'm just like, how did you decide that? Like, you're deciding what these things mean, because at the end of the day, these are just concepts. And he concludes, and that line of thinking does not seem elusive or far-fetched. And I was like, I don't know about that. Because right now we just have some giant thought experiment. We're imagining what a God is and what these definitions mean and how we want them to work. And they're not pointing to anything real. They're pointing to just us, having a circle jerk about being and God. And there's your question for the day. Is it better to have a circle jerk in the mind or in reality? There you go, people. I look forward to your comments on that. All right, question 3. But is real being just another thought or concept? Is real being just one more concept or characteristic like omniscience or omnipotence that could make a difference to the kind of being God is? So I would like to think that real being isn't just a thought or concept, that when we talk about real being, like, we are real beings, we have a physical presence, and of course we could go to, are we in a simulation? But even in some version of a simulation, we're pointing to ourselves as real beings, whatever that means. Kind of this Cartesian, I think, therefore I am. There is something doing the thinking. There is something thinking the thoughts, and that is the real being. Whether there's a God that can do that and have thoughts needs to be demonstrated. Let's move on to the answer. Reply. Real being does make a real difference. The question is, does it make a conceptual difference? Critics of the argument say that it does not. They say that just because real being makes all the difference, it cannot be one more quality among others. Rather, it is the condition of there being something there to have any qualities at all. When the proof says that God is the greatest being that can be thought, it means that there are various perfections or qualities that God has to a degree no creature possibly could, qualities that are supremely admirable. But to say that such a being exists is to say that there really is something which is supremely admirable, and that is not one more admirable quality among others. So I find this wording, various perfections, interesting, and again, a little slippery. Like, what are you talking about? Do you just mean that God is the perfect being and that there is nothing better, nothing greater? But various perfections strikes me as funny. Various qualities, he goes on to say too, that no creature possibly could except for God, and that these qualities are supremely admirable. Are they? I mean, God in the Bible is also a jealous God, and he does horrific things. But anyway, I guess the point they're trying to make is For something to have this level of perfection and admirability, it must exist. And again, we're just in a thought experiment. Kreeft goes on. Is it greater to exist in reality as well as in the mind? Of course, incomparably greater. But the difference is not a conceptual one, and yet the argument seems to treat it as if it were, as if the believer and the non-believer could not share the same concept of God. Clearly they do. They disagree not about the content of this concept, but about whether the kind of being it describes really exists. And that seems beyond the power of merely conceptual analysis as used in this argument to answer. So question 3, we think, really does invalidate this form of ontological argument. So once again, Kreeft acknowledges that this argument doesn't really work. But I'm not even sure we all share the same concept of God. I think that there are different understandings about who a God is, and obviously the triumny God of Christianity. I actually think that the Jews have a different conception of this Judeo-Christian God, but certainly you could look at other religions, the old Greek pantheon, Hinduism, the Nordic gods, all of this. There are different conceptions of God. So even to think that these gods would share this kind of perfection that has to exist in the mind and in reality, even the concept, I don't think we all share. Let's go on and see another formulation of the ontological argument. Modal version. Oh, all of you people who love modal logic, here we go. Charles Hartshorne and Norman Malcolm developed this version of the ontological argument. Both find it implicitly contained in the 3rd chapter of Anselm's Proslogion. Premise 1, the expression that being than which a greater cannot be thought. Oh my gosh, I have so much trouble reading that sentence. GCB for short. Oh, thank you for doing something that's easier to read. GCB expresses a consistent concept. 2, GCB cannot be thought of as A, necessarily non-existent, or as B, contingently existing, but only as C, necessarily existing. 3, so GCB can only be thought of as the kind of being that cannot not exist, that must exist. Oh, this is such convoluted language. 4, but what must be so is so. 5, therefore, GCB, i.e. God, exists. Of course, once again, we've defined the being, right? This GCB, we've defined God as this, but premise 2 just kind of once again defines all this into existence, like necessarily non-existent, contingently existing, or necessarily existing. Like, how do you know it can't contingently exist? How do you know that can't be the case? What if the greatest being cannot necessarily exist or, be separate from existence or whatever, but can only exist contingently? Like, that's part of its existence. And there's nothing greater than that. Like, you might hypothesize this thing, like it has to exist because that's part of my conception. But what if your conception does not link to reality? Again, we're just defining a being into existence. Off to our questions and replies. Question: just because GCB must be thought of as existing, does that mean that GCB really exists? Oh, awesome question. Reply: if you must think of something as existing, you cannot think of it as not existing. But then you cannot deny that GCB exists, for then you are thinking what you say cannot be thought, namely that GCB does not exist. So just because I can imagine this, like I've defined it in a certain way, so I've defined it as having to exist, so therefore it really has to exist because I've thought it that way. Again, not a riddle, we're playing word games here. Next up, we have the possible worlds version. This variation on the modal version has been worked out in great detail by Alvin Plantinga. We have done our best to simplify it. Definitions. See, we're defining shit. We're defining shit into existence. Maximal excellence, to have omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection in some world. Maximal excellence. Have we all understood? We have to have omnipotence and omniscience and moral perfection. I mean, I could add some stuff on that I think is maximal excellence too. We could all come up with things that we think is maximally excellent. Maximal greatness, to have maximal excellence in every possible world. 1, there is a possible world W in which there is a being X with maximal greatness. Again, we're just doing a thought experiment. Like, we don't know about these possible worlds, and we don't know about anything with maximal greatness. We're just positing, but okay. 2, but X is maximally great only if X has maximal excellence in every possible world. Right? Again, we're describing these things. We don't even know if other worlds are possible. Again, it's a hypothesis. It's a thought experiment. Not even a hypothesis, I guess. It's just word games. 3, therefore X is maximally great only if X has omnipotence, omniscience, and moral perfection in every possible world too. Because that's what we've decided. That's the way maximally great works in Plantinga's mind. 4, in W, the proposition there is no omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being would be possible, that is, necessarily false. 5, but what is impossible does not vary from world to world. 6, therefore the proposition there is no omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being is necessarily false in this actual world too. I find that kind of an interesting statement. Like, we're positing that there are other worlds and that there's this actual world. Well, they would be actual worlds too. I mean, we only know about this world. We don't know about other worlds. But anyway, 7, therefore, there actually exists in this world and must exist in every possible world an omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect being. And there we go. We've defined God into existence yet again. And I don't think it matters which version of this argument that we're looking at, because I think from the beginning, Kreeft already told us that this is not a valid argument. You know, maybe I have misunderstood the kind of deity that Christians posit when they talk about their triomni God. But it seems like God is above any of the physical worlds. So this play on different worlds, different possible worlds, once again is just word games, because it would seem like some God that stands outside of reality in some way. I'm not saying it's true. It's just, it doesn't seem to matter that there would be these other possible worlds, because the God would be outside all of them, so therefore would be part of all of them. I'm not quite sure how that would work. I'm not quite sure where the disembodied brain that is spaceless and timeless, where, when, how it could exist. Just that's what I've heard posited. So once again, I feel like these are just word games, creations and concepts and thought experiments that are sort of like a ha ha ha, I defined it all into being pew 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 pew, shoot out from the hip kind of stuff. And it's all dressed up in the language of philosophy. So there we go. This comes from Kreeft's website, and the kind of thing I like is it's like minimal blibbity blab, and he's not trying to just reach for everything that he possibly can to say, like, his God exists. This is a theist, a Catholic, and yet he seems to recognize when there are weaknesses in the argument. I think that's the philosophy training coming through. I might look some more at this page to see what else Kreeft has, because there are 20 arguments for God, and I'm kind of curious that some of the others, there are some I'm not sure I've seen actually formulated. So we'll see what I do with that. And what did you think about our 2 arguments, the ontological argument and the argument from truth? Put it in the comments below. And you know the drill. While you're down there, like, subscribe, do all the YouTube stuffing. Algorithma and his consort Algorithma really, really love to see you doing the YouTube stuffing, and they will reward you with all kinds of garbage, good recommendations on YouTube. Yeah, we know they're going to be garbage. And if you like what I do, you can buy me a coffee. Here is a QR code with my cute kitties who thank you so much for buying kibble and coffee and all kinds of nice things that keep this channel going on. And I think I'm going to do another argument. You know, I should have done a Christmas countdown, like the X number of arguments till Christmas or something like that. You know, note to self, you could do those clever kinds of things like channels do, instead of just like, hey, I think this is what I'll do this week. You know, randomly choose a topic or something like that. But anyway, that's what I have for you this week, and I'll see you soon for something different. You know, it's going to be stupid. Bye for now.